Start it up.
Right, so the full screen is going to start here.
And I have to go make Natalie a fancy title graphic. I think we are now not live yet. I don't know if we're live yet. Even if we're live. Hi, folks. Oh yeah, we are kind of live. Let me make this happen.
You are live.
I am live. I know. And I'm cutting to this. Okay, I'm cutting. You guys have control over the streams right now, I think. So if you want to switch over to the cameras. Cutting to this. Okay, I'm cutting. You guys have control over the streams right now, I think. So if you want to. Oh, I think Kayla can do this. Oh, now we got Sova.
Yep. Should be all good, yeah.
And are we live? I think we are live.
Awesome.
Go for it, Sova.
Okay, yeah, we're just waiting another minute here, but we're going to start, yeah.
You know, it starts exactly at 9:30. Whatever, that's good. Just to run it safe. I'll get a graphic going here.
Okay, cool.
An empathetic
people that I've ever met, and he's greatly missed by a lot of us here at CanSecWest and worldwide. So I'd like to just take a moment of silence to remember those that can't be with us anymore and all the contributions that they've made. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone back to our second day. Looking forward to challenging discourse, international camaraderie, and I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Natalie Silvanovich is from Google Project Zero, and she's been part of the Android security team in the past, currently focusing on message application security and video conferencing. Obviously, these are very important things post-pandemic and worldwide. She's also outside of her professional hacking experience. She's known for reverse engineering unique and exciting targets, including speaking at conferences on Tamaguchi hacking, which is pretty fun. Today she's going to be feeding us with tidbits of history of fully remote mobile capabilities. With that, I give you Natalie Silvanovich.
Arbitrary code on. It's a BlackBerry 8700. I was hired as a co-op student employee by the company that made it. And my first task was to evaluate the security of the browser. Less than a year later, I found my first fully remote mobile vulnerability. I still remember how excited I was. It wasn't an easy thing back then to send packets between mobile devices. You couldn't just write an application. Instead, I had to go beg and borrow this Nokia phone that you could set up like a modem, and then Scapy and send them. And eventually I did, and I went around telling all my coworkers, and they all gave me their IP addresses and were like, do me, do me, do me. The year was 2007, and it seemed like the mobile space had endless opportunity. I knew a secret. In a few months, BlackBerry phones were going to get Wi-Fi. A few months later, a new device called the iPhone would be released. But everyone knew it wouldn't catch on. It was in this environment we saw the beginning of modern mobile exploits. I'm Natalie Silvanovich, and I'm a member of Project Zero at Google. Project Zero is a team that aims to reduce prevalence and impact of zero-day vulnerabilities in the wild. We do this from a user-focused perspective, so we look at all sorts of software, not just Google software. And our goal is largely to find these vulnerabilities so that they can be fixed, and so that we can know more about how attackers use this. So to start off, I'm going to explain what I mean by the attacker would call the person over and over, and even though they didn't pick up, they were able to compromise WhatsApp and get access to their messages. And WhatsApp actually released some details on who the victims were as well. And they were basically academics, activists, and there was even a human rights lawyer who was one of the last victims. And he actually came out and said he updated before he was attacked, but then he got attacked, and he's one of the only known victims who's actually publicly discussed being targeted by this. But this was, even more evident in a real, in the wild 0 day. What's interesting is about a year earlier, I'd given a talk at Infiltrate, and I'd looked at varying video conferencing systems, and I'd found they had a lot of bugs in the video conferencing, but you had to pick up the call. So I would call a phone, and I'd pick it up, and then it would crash. And this gave me a lot of ideas about how this WhatsApp exploit worked. So my suspicion was that it was in the packet processing in the phone, and then they found some sort of bug that could bring this forward and make it so that this processing happened early. And that's my speculation, and I'll talk about, I did a bit more research on this later. But that was interesting, things were starting to ramp up. It was starting to become clear that a lot of this research wasn't just research, and attackers were really getting into this space. So then, at this point, Samuel Gross and I started looking at the iPhone, trying to find bugs that were similar to the Project Raven ones. And we looked at iMessage, in particular serialization, and we found 7 memory corruption bugs that we thought could be used to get fully remote code execution. Yeah, and just so you're aware, every bug I'm talking about after this point has been reported and fixed. So all these bugs we report, and there's been many changes made to all the devices we look at to make them less susceptible. But in this case, we found these memory corruption vulnerabilities, and then Samuel exploited one of them. He did something that was called memory oracle, which the idea is that when you send an iMessage to someone, if they read it, you might get a delivery receipt. But actually, as soon as it's delivered physically on the phone that sent it heard back, basically saying, you don't have to send this anymore. And we realized that if you do that and it crashes, you don't get the receipt back. So then Samuel did this thing where he would send, hundreds of messages with like a pointer and a certain location, or would cause a crash like that. And then if you can tell whether it crashed or whether it didn't, you can slowly map out what memory looks like, basically saying, is this valid? Is this valid? And then he was able to break ASLR by doing this. And I would say this took about 15 minutes, but this was really cool. This showed that these memory corruption bugs, for sure, could be used to get arbitrary code execution on an iPhone. And as a result of this, there actually were several changes made to how iMessage processes one. They actually reduced the attack surface a lot, and also they changed the privilege level of this processing. So this is not as useful as it once was. They also put in some mitigations that makes memory oracles harder. But about 2 years ago, this was very possible. There was also a really interesting talk at Black Hat that year by Tao Huang and Tai Wang, and it was about FaceTime. And basically, they found that when FaceTime calls are set up, there was a memory corruption vulnerability. So this is another possibility for a fully remote vuln, basically doing call setup and having a bug and then getting code execution. So this was another really cool piece of research at the time, which was in the iPhone space. Then Project Zero, we started doing a lot of research in this area. So Matthias Jurczyk did this on a Samsung phone. He basically found some image processing bugs, which I would say this is like almost similar to stage fright. You could send them to the MMS stack, and they would get processed on a fully remote way and then cause a crash. And like Samuel's memory oracle, he was able to set up exactly the same thing. That when you get an MMS, if it really arrives, the phone gets notified so they don't have to, keep trying to send it again. And then if you do this enough, you can detect where it crashes and then get a memory layout and then use this to break ASLR and get code execution. Then I tried to do this on Android devices. So I mentioned earlier that I did some research on WebRTC, and I found all sorts of bugs in media processing. And then I found some vulnerabilities in the protocol it uses called SCTP. And I exploited these bugs. But what was really interesting is that this WebRTC library is used for video conferencing on all sorts of things. It's used on Google Duo, it's used on Signal, it's used on Facebook. So I plugged this exploit into a lot of popular messengers and saw whether it worked. And I would say it worked in about half of them, and it was fully remote in about a quarter of them. It was fully remote in Duo and Signal and a few other big messengers. So this was really interesting. It showed that this was possible kind of in the generic Android and app space. It also was interesting that this widely used library made a lot of things susceptible. And like on the iPhone, a lot of changes were made as a result to this. In particular, Signal and Duo, now it's a lot harder to call a stranger and have protocols being processed. Now you have to accept the call by pressing a button before any of this processing happens. And then at the end of 2020, there was a report from Citizen Lab that said that they detected another zero-click exploit in iMessage. And this was surprising too, because after many, many years of nothing, now we have 3 reports in 1 year of this happening, 2 on iMessage and 1 on WhatsApp. Then what next? What's next? Well, there was Pwn to Own in 2021, and this had a fully remote exploit in Zoom. And this is an application bug like the WhatsApp one. But once again, interesting that there's more and more research in this space now, and like yet another thing that you could do the fully remote exploit on. And then finally, in 2021, there was this forced entry exploit found on iMessage in the wild. And what was super special about this one is that they actually captured the binary. They captured the real exploit, and Project Zero helped analyze it. And this was a fascinating exploit in that it was extremely complex. It was in image parsing in iMessage. So you would get a GIF file, and then iMessage would try and loop it so your GIF doesn't play just once. And when it did this, there was kind of a mistake in how iMessage processed it. And it would use all its processors, not just the image processors. And one of the processors that was used to process this was the JBig2 processor. And this format has a lot of features. So there was a buffer overflow in it. But what they also did is they ended up basically creating a Turing complete machine in this protocol to make the exploit work and get code execution. And what was interesting about that is just like how much work it was. Obviously, someone, NSO group, put tons and tons of effort into this exploit. And I do hope on some level it was due to some of the research and some of the mitigations that got put into the iPhone that made attackers have to resort to this as opposed to easier methods. But it also unfortunately means that they can still do this. And this is the end of the public research we have. I guess it's only 2022 now. So what next? Well, my belief is that fully remote exploits are more difficult to develop than ever, but also in higher demand than they've ever been. If you think about, back when we were exploiting Windows Mobile with a static stack with one bug, that was very easy. And certainly, even if it was hard to split open the device, once you put in that investment once, I suspect, an attacker would be like in bugs for like years after doing that. But even though it's harder now, and my suspicion is that dedicated teams take a long time to develop these exploits. In fact, Samuel and I, it took us many, many months together to find these bugs and exploit them. There's also much more profit opportunity. I think the demand is much higher based on just the number we've been detecting lately. And I think part of what's happening is this. 5 years ago, less than 10% of people were using a phone. And now a really large number of people are. So it's not surprising that with all this data, attackers want to make use of it. It also means, different people, almost everyone has a smartphone. So this means a lot of different attackers with a lot of different motivations get into this space. So what can we do about this? Well, one thing that I think is really important is detection. Without detection, I don't think Project Zero would have done any of our research in this area. And a lot of the other research as well, I think, was driven by the idea that we knew that this was possible. So it's very important that we continue to try and detect these types of exploits being used in the wild. It holds the party as accountable, it increases what's available to defenders, and it does take the attacker's toys away. Example with the WhatsApp exploit, one day they were doing it, and then the next day they were not because it had been fixed. Likewise, it's important to do research. It increases the info that's available to defenders. A lot of things were changed in mobile messengers as a result of research and as a result of 0 days detected in the wild that made exploitation more difficult. And without this information, we just don't know. And likewise, it also decreases vulnerability density. Every attacker has to put in effort to find a vulnerability, and the more effort this is, the less they have, and the more it costs to buy an exploit. Finally, there's a lot of possibilities in design. A lot of exploits that are possible are due to design aspects. There's needless attack surface. For example, some of the iMessage bugs, both the ones that Samuel and I found and the one that was found in the wild that used the JBig2 parser, they were all in things that didn't really improve the user experience, attack surface that was unnecessary. So I think it's important that software makers really try and reduce this, especially in the fully remote space, and make sure that every line of code that's giving users risk is also making users experience better. It's also important to try and make exploitation more difficult. And there's been some success with mitigations, especially things like ASLR and stat cookies, which have been around for a while now, but have made a big difference. But it's important that we keep working on memory mitigations to make exploitation even more difficult. Reducing the access gained by attackers is also important. And there has been a lot of splitting of privileges in messaging services. And this is really important because I'm only talking about the fully remote aspects of an exploit. But to get access to more stuff, they need to chain in other exploits. And the less privilege they get from this first exploit, the more they're going to need. So let's talk about the future. What's next? I don't really know. I would say there's only one thing that I know for sure, which is that our phones are going to become more important to us. We're going to use them more often. We're going to put more stuff on them, and attackers are going to want access. So we need to make sure that we keep them safe. And I think there's 2 directions things could go in. I think we could reduce attack surface, we could add mitigations, we could find bugs, or we could decide that this is a lost cause and not do anything. And the future of fully remote mobile exploitation is up to us. Thanks a lot, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the history of mobile exploits. And I don't think we have time for questions, but feel free to get in touch or grab me in the hallways if there's anything you want to know. Thanks a lot.
All right. So we have a brief break, I believe, next. And we have second breakfast. We do things Hobbit style here. So there's 2 breakfasts. You got your light breakfast and coffee to get you going. And then after that, you get your second breakfast. So we'll be back here, I believe 10:30 is when the next keynote will be presenting. See you guys all then. Also, I got a quick reminder, Samil's workshop yesterday on shell execution in ARM got rescheduled to this morning, and it's going to start in about 5 minutes right in the other room. So if you're hoping to be a part of that workshop, it's in the room right adjacent to this, and it'll be starting in about 5 minutes.
Solo?
Hey, hey, Robert.
Hi. Someone in the chat was wondering, the ARM shell workshop is going to be streamed out, right?
The Arm Shell Workshop? Nope.
It's not?
It's not. It's going to be in the
Not doing anything
Zoom.
Embarrassing.
Pardon?
It seems like it's working, right?
Oh, it's going to be on Zoom, right?
It's going to be on Zoom. But
Okay.
do we have slides here yet?
Okay. I was just curious because
Could
someone
you,
was asking.
We'll entertain folks on the stream with my image here, and we'll tell. Oh, yeah, there we go. And show off my new face tracking camera. In the meanwhile, we've been trying to figure out stuff for the Ponton streams. The magic of this conference that's going to be has been complicated with so many people hitting in with Zoom and hammering their networks. The uplinks are starting to be flaky. Hey, I heard somebody.
It was not me.
All right, let's see what we're doing here. I am trying to join a mobile client to the Zoom so I can wander around and talk to you guys. So let's do that. Live, waving to everybody.
Are we getting a lot of views on Facebook?
You know what? I have no idea right now. Let me go check restream statistics while we're live here. What's going on? View analytics. Let's see the analytics. What is Restream giving us these days? The problem with all these video platforms is they constantly mutate as they all race for features.
Features that no one uses?
They don't even know. So the thing is, they don't even know how many features they have. So there's about a dozen people watching on the somewhere right now. I think, yeah, something like that. These statistics, it can just give you a total right now. So.
Okay, I was just curious. That's all.
Yeah, I was. It was very curious
Lucky
for
for
me
us.
too. Why is this invalid meeting ID? 860.
Super secure password. And is the webcam being used for anything on my laptop?
No, we are not using the web.
We can just.
Nope.
Great.
Where's my no button?
Perfect. Yep. We'll do some Jimi Hendrix presentation mode. Feedback.
Okay, I'm gonna switch to you guys. And we're gonna get feedback.
I feel like I should tell Drago so I can see up his nose.
You can see up my nose. I hear you. And I'm about to turn this thing down so we don't get feedback. And I can hear you, and now everybody can hear me. All right.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can get switch to that over here.
Cool.
All right.
Zoom is super
cut to
familiar
this.
these days, at least, so I'm good.
So you guys can cut to that.
Yep.
And I'm going to assign Zoom powers over here.
You're working.
All right, check, check, check. Now you can hear me. The people on the stream can't necessarily see me, so let's just go over here.
It's fine. Can you give me an idea of, since the timing's a bit messed up, how long we should be going till? Is it still 11:30 or?
is a little
It looks like we might be.
show, but what's going on in the background over here? The other thing I'm going to
So then I go
do
to 11:38.
is go bring a wireless access point with me. Let's go take this little bad boy over here. Walk around.
It was a big rush. It's very hard to remember that day though, just because with the adrenaline, you know, it's got to go back and watch the video. It's like when you get married or something. I'm actually more proud of my than that. The hacking team we set up PPP and how often it wins.
So we're very close to starting on time. I'm going to give everybody a couple more minutes and then we're going to get going here.
Started once without draggers.
Hello, everybody on the internet.
Hi.
Yeah, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully second breakfast was as tasty as first breakfast. For those of you online, you'll have to make your own breakfasts. You ready to go, Dragos? Okay. It's with great pleasure that I am here to introduce our next keynote speaker. Dr. David Brumley is CEO for All Secure. He's also a tenured professor at Carnegie Mellon and has a PhD from Carnegie Mellon and an MS from Stanford University. Dr. Brumley is the author of over 50 publications in computer science and received numerous awards, including the US PCASE Award from President Obama. It's the highest award in the US for early career scientists and engineers. He also impressively won the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge in 2012 with their Project Mayhem, which is their autonomous cybersecurity system. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Brumley, our next keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. You know, sometimes I feel like offense just moves too fast and that defense is just too slow. I remember the first time I got this feeling where I just couldn't win. I had just gotten out of school and I was working as the computer security officer at Stanford University. Today, the CISO title is a big role. Right back then, it was essentially doing incident response. I remember this one particular incident where a computer was hacked and it belonged to a Nobel Prize physicist. I noticed it because the hacker got on irc.stanford.edu, and I had a little script that would like do a who is of the computer, and it was kind of odd for a Nobel Prize winning physicist to be on IRC, believe it or not. So I called him up kind of nervously and said, sir, your machine has been hacked. I've taken it offline, and to get back online, you're gonna have to reinstall from scratch. You're gonna have to update to the latest OS and install the latest patches. Well, the professor was really nice and polite, but he pushed back. He said, look, I'm doing groundbreaking research, and I'm not sure whether or not this custom software that we're running is gonna run on the latest version of Red Hat, which was a good point. The second question he had is, suppose I do go through all this work, is this gonna be a regular occurrence, or am I gonna be able to not get hacked again? And so I spent some time with him. I helped him reinstall, and it turned out his custom groundbreaking research software did work on the latest version of Red Hat. It wasn't actually a problem. And I actually helped him lock down his system so that every service was turned off except for SSH. He had good passwords. All the patches were applied. But then just 2 weeks later, that's when I got that sinking feeling that I just couldn't win because his computer was hacked again. So I had to call him up meekishly and say, hey, despite everything we've done, I've had to take you offline again. And so I went over to his computer and I tried to figure out what had happened. And what had happened is the hacker had found a 0-day in SSH and started compromising machines. In fact, this was a different hacker, right? So the hacker had broken in, and then worse than that, he started to pivot across the Stanford network. And so he scanned the Stanford network. And so I stopped what I was doing. I helped the professor turn off his machine and figure out what to do in the interim. Went back to my desk, looked at network logs, and looked at these dozens of machines, and it just felt hopeless. And so I started to reach out to the various people who had been compromised. One of them actually turned out to be google.stanford.edu. So I called up Larry Page and had the same conversation. I actually turned off Google from the internet one day. Now, I tell this story really because it was a changing moment in my life. No one likes to be in the seat where they always feel like they're losing. And so at that point, I decided to go back to school, and that's when I got the master's. I got a PhD and spent the last really 23 years doing research on this question of how do we beat attackers? And there's a couple things that stand out to me that I really learned during that time. The first is really what that professor told me, which is, look, I'm not sure whether the patches will break something. Conferences like this are amazing, and what people do at Pwn2Own is just like out of this world. But really just going out and finding the exploitable bug, while super cool, you gotta be careful not to pat yourself on the back, because until that patch is deployed, things aren't more secure. And too often in security, we forget that. We look at the problem and say, we pointed it out, we did our job, but that's not really the solution. And the second is, we have to figure out how people are finding 0 days and actually figure out how to beat them. Now, I think computer security is actually quickly reaching a crisis. Everyone's gonna tell you that, and I can't forward my slides, there we go. Everyone will tell you that, hey, there's too many attackers, too few defenders. But I thought one thing I could maybe give you is a little bit of a visual. Now, first, I don't think the problem is too many hackers or attackers, too few defenders. I actually think the problem revolves around the speed and pace of development of software. This is a picture of Texas Longhorn Stadium. It seats about 100,000 people. Now, on the field, there's about 200 people. GitHub now reports that there's 500 developers for every computer security expert. That means the computer security experts, imagine those are the people on the field, they're trying to secure all the software made by the developers, the audience of this. Another way to think of it is here at CanSecWest, my understanding is there's about 200 people registered. And so everyone here at CanSecWest, your job would be to secure the software developed by that crowd. It's just crazy, right? Like 501 is hard to imagine, but that's what we're working with. And so I've been on this mission to automatically check and protect the world's software. And it really starts with this idea of, can we find exploitable bugs first? And then can we fix them? And then can we test those fixes to make sure they don't break anything? And I have here that we want to test them first for functionality, even above security. When you put out a fix, if it breaks functionality, no one is going to install it. Performance is another key factor. If you have lower performance, again, people will delay. And finally, is it more secure? And then you have to deploy your software. Now, at the same time, we're going through this loop as defenders. Attackers are going through a similar loop. They're trying to find exploitable bugs. And then once they find them, they're going to go through some work to weaponize them. And that weaponization may take a lot of time or a little bit of time, we don't know. But once they weaponize, they can go and attack all our different systems. So I've actually just want to point out, I've broken out here weaponization because it is a really cool step. This is where a lot of the human creativity shines, where you have a control flow hijack exploit, but they have ASLR and def enabled and the sandbox, and you have to put 3 together to finally weaponize it. That's what the attackers do, but still that bug exists and we need to get rid of it. So my research for the past really almost quarter of a century now is how do we automate this? How do we build robots that can do the boring stuff? I got really inspired by Deep Blue because Deep Blue can look through the different states of a chess game and really beat the best humans out there. And it took a while to get there, right? You can see this progression of chess. I believe that we can do the same thing in computer security. Humans will always be needed for the creative aspects, imagining the new scenario. But we can build computers that can automate and work just so much faster than humans once that's done. So the agenda of the day is pretty simple. I just want to tell you what the art of the possible is and what we're found in research. And I'll give you a couple anecdotes from my own personal life. I also then want to switch to what is the go-to-market to change the art of the practice in the status quo. The reason I want to touch on this is often we present papers. In fact, this has been my life of presenting papers. You get a best paper award and you're like patting yourself on the back, and yet nothing changes in the market. And so, to quote the Beatles, what's the plan? We need a plan to take that research, to take those best practices and get them to the common developer. And I wouldn't just say it's a research versus for industry problem. You also see this between companies like Google and your small and medium-sized businesses, where small and medium-sized businesses are like, that's great for Google, they print cash, they can hire any developer they want. We can't. How are we going to go about this? And then finally, how you can help. So it started actually in 2014, not 2012, where DARPA asked this question: is autonomous attack and defense possible? This was asked by a DARPA PM named Mike. Mike was part of actually a winning DEF CON team. He had a black badge from DEF CON CTF. And he said, look, what humans do in DEF CON CTF is amazing, and it's really representative of this micro universe of attackers are breaking into systems, and defenders have to prevent that. And so let's see if we can teach computers to do that. I'm going to put $60 million of US taxpayer money into this, and I'm going to offer a $2 million cash prize if you can show it's possible. And they called it the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge. This was not a name chosen idly. DARPA does not do grand challenges often. They did the first grand challenge was self-driving cars. And they call them grand challenges because the possible answers are both yes and no. In fact, the first self-driving car challenge, the answer was no. None of the cars went more than a few feet. So they put out this challenge and said, hey, there's all this research, all these great claims. Is it actually possible? And so I'll give you a little bit of the setting here. The setting was, first, when we talk about finding exploitable bugs, there's some amount of creativity in defining what a bug is, right? Like before people studied timing attacks, people didn't know to look for timing vulnerabilities. But here we're going to say they're standard execution monitor enforceable properties. If you want to know the definition, think of this as just something that a runtime monitor can detect. At some point, you've gone from a bad state to a good state. You've overwritten memory, you've violated a password policy, something like that. It's going to be machine only, no human. So the systems are going to sit up there, and not only do they have to deal with attack and defense, they have to deal with things like disk failures. And then finally, and I'll touch this because this is really a big impact when you look at your go-to-market. The attacker and defender both host and can run the app in their own hardware. And so if we go back to this picture, all these computers were running the same binary software, no source code, and the goal was to go and find exploitable bugs, attack your adversary, break into them, you got a point, and if they broke into you, you lost a point. I want to come back to this, so put it in the back of your mind. It's going to be really important when you talk about go-to-market, because this is actually one of the first assumptions that can get violated. So the status quo when we looked at this problem was really to use static analysis. Now, when I first went back to Stanford, I studied with a person named Monica Lamb. She's kind of famous because if you've seen the Hackers movies, they talk about the Dragon book. It's a real book in compilers, and she's one of the authors of it. And then I studied with a guy named Dawson Engler as well. Dawson Engler, in his research on metal, became Coverity. And so I'm well versed in this idea of the status quo as static analysis, and it's got this beautiful kind of alluring vibe to it, where we want to beat attackers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this tool, and this tool is going to find every possible exploitable bug. I'm going to have this big checklist, and if I can just get through them, well, then I'm going to be safe. And then, of course, attackers, if that works for defenders, should also be doing this. What we should be seeing is Project Zero running static analysis tools to go find those exploitable bugs, because you're going to find all of them. And as long as your tool is good enough, it's worth going through. Certainly at the nation state level, when you're looking at hard targets, you would go through long, long lists with the idea of just finding that one possibility. Now, at Pwn to Own 2021, there was a drone attack where a drone was shown to take over a Tesla with a zero-click exploit. The problem was in DHCP, in a DNS proxy. But if you think about it, what static analysis tools are doing is they're essentially just highlighting a line of code for a human to then go and triage. This is the actual line of code from CanSecWest 2021, where there's a possible out-of-bounds mem copy. There is an out-of-bounds mem copy, and this is what the drone ended up using to unlock the car. So this is the status quo. This is the idea. We're just going to create this list. But it turns out it doesn't work for a couple of reasons. First, by definition, these tools have false positives. And we can get into the theory of why, but by definition, they're going to have false positives, which means you need a manual person to check the results. Essentially, you have a security tool who can lie to you. It's an over-approximation potentially, but it's lying to you. And so you have to have a human. And so that technique wouldn't work. But more importantly, what we found is static analysis had insufficient fidelity. There's a big difference between an exploit and a vulnerability. That mem copy may be a vulnerability, but whether or not you can exploit it depends enormously on low-level details. You could have a buffer overflow in C that can't be exploited and is not actually a vulnerability when you compile the code because of things like page-to-line compilers when the compiler page lines. And so this dream of static analysis didn't really match reality from the defender standpoint. The second point actually from it is every time you go and change software, you're going to have that same problem Robert Laughlin, the Nobel Prize physicist, asked me, which is how do I test that change to make sure nothing broke? And you can't do that really with static analysis. All you know is your checker, that black magic, stopped reporting an error. So it's untestable true positives, as well as there's no way to help test the patch. And so when you want to automate this cycle, it doesn't really help for someone to come up and give you a long line of maybes. It's not so actionable. And my experience has been when you go and look at attackers, they don't typically use static analysis, not in any sort of real capacity. And I could be wrong. I'm basing this on my experience at CMU, where I've had the really privilege to work with some of the best hackers I've ever known, people like Fluorescence, who have won Pwn to Own, and George Hotz. And I've never once seen them use a static analysis. And so when you go and look at this, we all quickly arrived on this idea that we want to use dynamic analysis. And I want to emphasize, this is actually a pretty radical difference between how we went about automating and what the status quo thinks you should do. And really, I think it gets at this idea of the difference between a vulnerability and exploit. What you're trying to do is defend against exploitable bugs. An exploit is that drone opening the doors. That line of code is devoid of those details. You want to create the thing on the right, the thing on the left, in. So the technical intuition of why this didn't work is really, when you think about it, there's okay code and there's buggy code. You can think of this at the per function level. You can think of entire functions. It doesn't, entire programs. It doesn't matter. So here we have 10 different, let's call them functions, right? And you're going to run your static analysis. That's one of the approaches. Really, the big lie in academia is when you go read an academic static analysis paper, they always talk about soundness. And what soundness means, actually, if you read the definition, is if I say it's bug-free, it really is bug-free. There's nothing in that definition that talks about finding a vulnerability. In fact, what happens is they just say, well, I couldn't prove it was bug-free. You got to go look at that. Maybe it's vulnerable, because we can't verify it's bug-free. So there's a little bit of a lie there when you look at static analysis and you look at academics and how they write papers. Now, this guy Dawson Ingler I mentioned, absolutely genius. What he does is one day at Stanford, before he had 10 years, he said, look, I don't care about soundness. I don't care about pushing theorems. I don't need to prove how smart I am to anyone. I just want to find bugs. I'm going to make a tool that's neither sound nor complete. I'm going to find something that just goes and looks for bugs. And what he did is they would parse a program, create an AST or a control flow graph, and then look for little patterns. And essentially, if you go look at all commercial static analysis tools, this is what they do today. They're looking for patterns. And maybe on the control flow graph, they may say they do data flow analysis, but again, it's not really academic. The problem is they have both false positives and false negatives. In fact, if you go look at the statistics, it's very hard to find big ones because these are often commercial tools. But typically, you're going to find the actual detection rate, the true positive rate, is only 50% of the known vulnerabilities. Plus, again, it's not actionable. And then what you'll find is as soon as you get to a detection rate of 50%, you also end up with a false positive rate of 50%. So you have this kind of tune thing where you can lower false positives, but you lower your detection rate as well. And so there's a little bit of a lie here. And I just wanted to point out, when you say static analysis, industry static analysis and academic static analysis use exactly the same word, but mean completely different things. Now, there's been this growing area of research in dynamic analysis. When I started at CMU as a professor and where I started doing research, I was really motivated by this. Because what I could do is I could actually run the executable code. I was working at the fidelity of finding the exploitable bug. And I thought, just even more importantly, there's a lot of closed source programs out there. If I can develop tools that work on executable code, well, then I can check the security of that code myself. I think this idea that developers, as soon as you find a vulnerability, you need to tell the developers, I'm pretty sure that's right. But I also think many developers don't care or don't have capacity to deal with that. We need to enable it so everyone can check the code that they're going to execute. And so dynamic analysis had this. Now, the cool thing about it is the longer you run it, the more you'll find. It's a different mindset. It's not a scan and sweep. It's really much more like an attacker, where if you give Natalie 2 hours, she won't do as good as if you give her 2 weeks. She's going to find more and more and deeper results. So when we went down this area, there was really 2 approaches that we could take. There's coverage-guided fuzzing and there's symbolic execution. I think we're all pretty familiar with coverage-guided fuzzing, and so I'll just kind of briefly define it. Really, I think one of the things that we need to do as a community is stop calling fuzzing random testing. As soon as you do that, everyone thinks it's dumb. That was certainly fuzzing back when Mark Miller did it, back in 1980. But, I mean, come on. Big hair was popular then, too. So really what it is a negative testing technique that generates inputs with the goal of eliciting new code coverage. The idea is that all an exploit is an input that triggers previously under-tested code, where it takes a known input, mutates it, runs the program with the mutated, and keeps the mutation if coverage is improved. So, for example, you may come up with a mutation x equals 120, run the program, and see, it took this program path, that's new code, I'm going to keep it. Now, if you run that exact same program on input 122, it takes the same path, you're going to throw away that mutation because it doesn't execute new code. And you're going to do this as quickly as possible. There are amazing tools like AFL, LibFuzzer that do this. One of the big things that we were looking at is, can we do this with binary code? And I think we can, and I think others can as well now too. But there's 2 problems with this. First, it's unlikely to hit very delicate conditions. So here I have this, if y equals a very particular integer, jump stack. Now, jump stack, of course, being like a return buffer overflow. Now, it's very unlikely to pick this particular value of y. Now, there's various heuristics that people can pick. For example, you can say, well, I'm going to look for comparisons, and I'm going to pick things that meet that comparison. Well, that doesn't work here because y is actually calculated from x. It's x squared, right? So just saying I'm going to input a y that's dead B4, B04 is not going to work. The second is, and this is really important, that coverage doesn't necessarily mean that you found all bugs. Here we have, at the very bottom, divide by 0, right? If I is 0, you get undefined behavior. You get a processor exception if that's an integer, or I'm not actually sure what you get if you're floating point. You get a sigfp, certainly if it's an integer. The point of this is that you don't just want coverage. Coverage is like a heuristic, but it may not talk about different behaviors in the program. So the idea behind symbolic execution was, look, what we're going to do is we're going to pick a program path, and we're going to be able to mathematically model that program path in first-order logic. And so instead of executing on a concrete input, we're going to execute on a symbolic input, and it's going to create a formula. So for this path, x is greater than 100, and then x is, less than 100, and y equals x squared, and so on, to create a formula that's true for the path that we've selected. Now, if we want to execute a different path, we can just flip a branch condition. So we can just take this formula and say, oh, well, the first time I went down this program, I executed that last statement, z equals y divided by I, because this branch above it failed. Let's flip the branch condition and create a formula that's satisfiable when we take the branches that we want. And then we can give this to an SMT solver that will give us an input that takes that selected branch. And so really what we've done is we've taken a program, And we said, look, programs modify state. The difference between that and first order logic is pretty small. We just have to make it so it doesn't modify state. Give it to an SMT solver. And we can, by definition, generate an input that takes us down the selected path. And we can just iterate this over and over again to go and get more and more coverage. So the second problem that we ran into is not just getting coverage, but how do we go from just triggering a particular piece of code to actually generating an exploit? And we started working on this problem, and we called it automated exploit generation. The funny thing about it, and I think this was kind of our big idea, or the big idea, not just by us, but by others, is it's really verification with a twist. Typically in program verification, you're going to take in a program and you're going to try to verify a correctness property, and it's going to output whether it's correct or incorrect. Now, the reason that we can't verify programs automatically is because there's loops. We have our good friend, the original crypto hacker, Alan Turing, who proved undecidability for programs, and then we have Rice's theorem, which follows. We know that without human effort, you can't do this fully automatically. But the twist is, if we look at programs path by path, now you have a finite state machine. Now it is decidable. And instead of looking for correctness, well, correctness is just whatever you write down in logic. I can write down in logic and overwrite a return address and put my shell code here. And if I tack that onto my condition in symbolic execution, I can then not just generate an input that takes me down the particular code that I want to execute, but also generate an exploit. So this is what we were working on, POC exploit generation completely automatically, where we generate the formula. The formula would take us down the program path, and then we found something like, oh, EIP is user controllable. Let's add in conditions to actually put in our shell code and launch it. So we were pretty excited about this. We're automatically generating exploits. We published it in academia. It got great reviews. It got accepted. But funny thing, just kind of a fun anecdote, is in industry, people hated this paper. I got tons of hate mail saying these aren't real exploits. You can actually go find those today. The point is that we were not trying to say, hey, humans who are doing ROB aren't doing something that we can't do. What we were trying to do is saying we need to push the state of the art about what we can do, because there's just too few humans to do this sort of thing. And so we continued working on it. What's kind of funny is these are kind of standardized techniques today. It was funny, last year I read a GitHub blog that says we need more research in automated exploit generation. And this is what we're doing. The other funny thing about this is that actually the corollary is that any advances in verification technology will also help adversaries. If you think about it, typically when you're working about program correctness, you're trying to verify it's correct. You can just add in correctness means I can exploit it, because for an attacker, that's what it means. And if you verify that property, well, it's exploitable. Kind of a cool thing. So as we were doing this, one of the things that we found was that building symbolic execution is a really interesting area. That's because it requires high precision. I want to give the analogy. It's a little bit like building a space shuttle or a rocket. When you have the space shuttle, if you have one misplaced ceramic tile, game's over on entry. Or when you're building a rocket, if you're just a few degrees off, it'll go to the wrong place or to blow up on the launch pad. Symbolic execution is like this. It doesn't tolerate errors well. And so there was a lot of research that we had to do. For example, how do we maximize returns on symbolic execution? We're going to be asking a SAT solver to solve this formula. We know that's NP hard, NP complete. How do we do that quickly? What do we do about exponential size formula generation? How do we work with SMT? So by definition, SAT solvers are just heuristic engines. How do we work with those efficiently? Smart formula generation and so on. And so if you read the research in this, and this is still ongoing, this is what people are doing. So I'll give you a couple of kind of interesting quips. So the first thing is, how long do queries take on average? So I'm going to create a query, give it to an SMT solver. It actually takes 3.67 milliseconds on average with a 0.034 variance. What this means is that when you give it a query for a path formula, it's quick. Should I optimize hard or easy formula? We ask this question because when you go and you look at researchers, they'll often say, here is a place symbolic execution did not work because things got too hard. What if it got too hard? And it turns out in practice, that's not the barrier. 99.99% of queries take 1 second or less and account for 78% of total time. That means you get more bang for the buck making easy queries even faster than taking a hard query and making it a little bit faster. You're going to get better scientific throughput. Another question people would ask is, do queries get harder the deeper that you go? They'd say you're building this formula, and of course the math gets more complicated the deeper you go, and that's a really good question. Turns out it probably isn't the case. This is a 4D graph where we show the depth of execution on the x-axis, the time to solve on the y-axis. We have color coding for the number of nodes in the size of the formula, And then we return whether it's satisfiable or unsatisfiable, right? Because you could have different behaviors, whether or not you can solve it, satisfiable, or can't solve it, it's unsatisfiable. And what you really see here is there's no upward trend where as you get more and more deep that you cannot solve the formula. Let me actually put it on a log scale to make it a little bit easier. What you see actually is size is not correlated with hardness. When formulas are small, they're almost always satisfiable. You know, if someone says x is greater than 2, it's really easy to find an x that's greater than 2. And when formulas get really big as you get deep, often you'll immediately find two different things that contradict each other. You'll find one statement that says x is greater than 2 and another one that says x is less than 2. Immediately you can throw away the rest of the formula and say it's unsat. And really there's this area of search in the middle where things get difficult. It's called the phase transition actually in SAT. And so there's kind of this medium that actually is the hard part. And then of course, as I said, exponential program, typically what people do is they generate a path formula and there's an exponential number of paths for a fixed number of loops. And we ended up publishing a paper called Veritesting to avoid exponential formula explosion. It turns out this technique was so valuable that we used it in CGC, but also the number 3 team used Veritesting in their approach for solving this DARPA challenge. So what do we do? So at the end of the day, I did all this academic research in symbolic execution. I had kind of fallen into the same trap that I accused static analysis of. I could push formulas, I could push logic. It was easy to write papers about. It turns out in practice, actually, you want to combine it with fuzzing. And the intuition for that is fuzzing runs really fast. You have this, essentially this fast guessing behavior. And if you can just guess really, really fast, often you can come up with the right answer really, really quick. But there's these cases where fuzzing will get stuck, like the one I showed you. And that's where you want symbolic execution to actually break through. And so what the best research shows today is you want to run a portfolio algorithm. Not just we're saying this. There was also a great paper called Driller from the UCSB guys that showed really when you run these things together, you're going to get better results. I mention this because sometimes you'll read people say, I tried fuzzing, I didn't try symbolic, symbolic's too hard. What this shows is really the portfolio is the best approach. So when we get back to this idea of can we automatically do what attackers do, the art of the possible is yes, we can. Essentially, what everyone has concluded is running a portfolio of symbolic execution fuzzing will give you the best performance for finding exploitable bugs. It turned out this patching problem was not the hard one. Going in and saying, okay, I have an input that triggers this buffer overflow, this divide by 0, this logic bug, coming up with a patch that just prevents you from getting exploited is not hard. The hard part is testing it. And this is where actually symbolic execution shines through, and I don't think security researchers actually appreciate this. What we would do is every time we found a bug, we propose a fix, and actually a set of fixes. And then we would take that test suite created by the fuzzer symbolic execution and run it and measure functionality, performance, and security. And then we would only field the patches that met our overall business requirements. So we could actually propose 10 patches, see which one worked the best, and then field the most appropriate one. This is something that if you go look at static analysis, they can never do. Static analysis can never auto-patch. They could propose a patch, but because they can't test it, they're always going to require a human. Now, on the find the bug side, this was a really fun place. We could weaponize automatically, and we could do things like control flow hijack. We could do memory disclosure. And of course, there's limits to this, but it is an area that people are working on. So the art of the possible is yes. I think this gives us hope. When you go back to this idea of there's, in a football field, there's 200 people on the field and 100,000 in the stands, we can do what we can do best. We can leverage superior technology, better engineering to get ahead. So it is possible. So I want to take a few moments to talk about the status quo. So after we won the Cyber Grand Challenge, we were super excited, probably a little bit full of ourselves. In fact, Mayhem won it. We won $2 million. We used that to kind of bootstrap our company. Mayhem then went on to play in DEF CON CTF, and though it didn't win, it still did reasonably well for a machine. I thought that was pretty cool that it could even be competitive with someone like Fluorescence and Pondo. That we could, Mayhem found exploitable bugs and created exploits for ones that PPP thought were unexploitable. The top hacking team that year. But then we went out and we said, okay, we want to bring this to market. What are going to be the challenges? And we thought it'd be easy. We thought, you show people the art of the possible and they'll follow. I'm sure you've all heard the story of VHS and Betamax. Betamax was a superior technology for VHS, but VHS won. the best idea is not always the one that wins out. It's a beautiful thing in engineering we think of, but it actually is not the truth. So to recap the state of the art possible, $60 million was invested showing this was possible. Google, since then, has launched OSS Fuzz with incredible success. Microsoft's software development lifecycle requires fuzzing, which is this core ingredient to do automated testing, automated verification, even automatic exploit generation. And even at CMU, we had started to run this at a large scale to really look at this law of large numbers, where we looked at 32,000 programs, found 2 million crashes, 11,687 previously unknown bugs, and we were able to generate automatically 152 control flow hijack exploit POCs, right? And so this is starting to show, hey, the real advantage is you can start applying these things at mass. Maybe if you give me 100 programs, you give me this one, I fail, but the other 99, I succeed on. That way the human is reduced to only having to work on one. So why isn't everyone doing this? Well, I found this quote, and I hate to go out and just kind of quote random people, but I think it's a good one, where Steve Jobs said, to me, ideas are worth nothing unless executed. They're also just a multiplier. When you go and you try to raise VC money, for example, you start talking about your patents, and VCs don't care about your patents. Those are just ideas. What really matters is the team. Can you execute? And so I want to talk about how we're executing today and some of the things we learned. So first, I invite you just to go to forallsecure.com. You can go and actually try our tools today. I'll show you what it looks like in fact. I've got to get out of this window. So one of the things we've worked really hard on doing is making sure that our interface is pretty quick, pretty easy to use. So I want to go over a little example. One of the examples that we've often used is a web server called Lighty. And we'll look at a well-known vulnerability. If you go to our website, you can actually find 0 days in the last few years. But this one's been well-known out there. The reason I use this example is because it's really illustrative of the problem out there. So Lighty is not just a web server. It does SODL open, so it loads in dynamic libraries. It has a configuration file. In some configurations, it may be vulnerable, and some it may not. It's really important to get all those things right. So it's running across the world even today. And in fact, sadly, it's used on Siemens controllers, on GRPS routers that are basically VPNs for energy systems out there today. So one of the things that we've really tried to work hard on is how do we make it easy? And what we've settled on is this idea of you can take in a Docker image. And so if we just search, we integrate also with Docker Hub. You can pick out a Docker image and hit go. And we're trying to get away from all that configuration typically you'd have to do in fuzzing. So Mayhem handles network inputs without any harnessing. It handles binaries without any harnessing. You can say you can run forever or specify a runtime. Well, actually even automatically pick out the command that we should be trying to break into from the Docker image run command. And we have some things like we can do advanced analysis or just more basic analysis. And then you just click run. So there's a couple things that we do here. The very first one is we first are a distributed system, so we go get workers to do it. In the top right corner, you'll see exploitability factors. We try to measure, is ASLR enabled, our stack piece, our dev. Natalie just said these actually are real things that make exploiting real harder. And it's a lightweight thing that you can just automatically check, so why not check it? It makes weaponization harder. But then Mayhem just goes and it starts creating a test suite. And so it's running here, 1,000 executions per second. We go and we do what's called min settings. So we take all those executions, we reduce it to the minimal set of inputs necessary to reproduce all test cases. By the way, if you go read the AFL source code, their idea of min setting is wrong, as well as the fuzzer. There's actually an algorithm for doing this. And then, of course, when we find a bug, we'll go through it and we'll triage it. And so it's already found the bug. Now, the key thing, the thing that I love about this approach is when I was doing static analysis research, I'd have to go manually and triage everything. Here you get a test case. And so here's one test case that triggers 10 different vulnerabilities or 10 different issues in the code by unique stack trace. Even better, when you're trying to convince someone, if you go out and say, hey, I'm a product and I have 0 false positives, people just kind of shut off. They think that it's marketing. But really what I'm saying is I actually don't find vulnerabilities. I find inputs that trigger bugs, and then later on I figure out that they're vulnerabilities. It's different. Where if you simply take the output of the tool, you can just replay it, and here it's crashing the web server. Now this isn't a weaponized exploit. We actually removed the weaponization from our commercial product because why do it? But here's something that's very convincing to people. Hey, I just gave you an input that can crash that server. It also, people will tell me if you go and you take a package and you harness this one function, you can get higher execs per second and find more bugs. That's true. But then you have to manually backtrace. And so there is a little bit of a pro and a con here, where the more you do that, you're adding a human to the loop. And so we're trying to work on, can we make it fully automatic, even if, for example, this has other, it's not perfect. That's Mayhem. Anyone who wants can go to actually mayhem.forallsecure.com and get a free account. All right. So I wanted to mention a couple of things that were surprising to us. So there's this beautiful paper. I recommend everyone read it, from Dawson Engler, who, as I said, he revolutionized static analysis when he said, look, I'm not going to be sound, I'm just going to find bugs. He wrote this paper about, okay, we now commercialize coverity. What did we learn? And I find this really interesting, because the things he talks about here are actually often the gaps you still see today between security or researchers and what you find in practice. In fact, this is a beautiful quote: however, the problems we encountered were not the obvious ones. So for example, one of the obvious ones is he ran this, and his tool worked great on GCC compiled code. Remember, this is like 2000, 2005. Everyone was using GCC, Clang didn't exist. And then what he found out is, hey, I went out into industry and people didn't use GCC. They used Borderland C++, or they used this old version of GCC that didn't parse the same way we did. I challenge you, go take an old version of objdump, like one from 10 years ago, and try to compile it with a modern GCC. It just won't work. And so those are the sorts of problems you have to deal with when going into practice. And so I believe that what we need are more onboarded projects, more than advanced research. People will often go and say, what about this new paper? Why haven't you worked on that? I don't care about that stuff anymore. I think the state of fuzzing, the state of symbolic execution is good enough for me. The problem is, how do we bring more of that world software into this ecosystem so that we can automate better and better? So a couple of things. First, user can upload an app easily. Well, I showed you Lighty, you pointed at a Docker image. The reason that we did that is because Docker fully encapsulates the runtime environment. It has the shared libraries. It has the configuration. Those are DL open shared libraries, so you can't just figure them out by yourself. The reason that we did this is when we first released Mayhem, people would have to upload the binary, and it was super error prone. Where people would upload the binary, run analysis, it would fail. Oh, I forgot the configuration file. Run it again. Oh, it'd fail. I don't know why. It turns out there's a DL open. And it was just a terrible user experience. And this was a huge barrier. And so we made it easier. We thought, hey, users already done some testing and can write a test harness. What we found is security people cannot do this. In fact, even developers don't do this. This is a graph, a survey taken from JetBrains on C-specific results, where my favorite answer here was, which unit testing framework do you use regularly, if any? And 23% said, I write unit tests but don't use any framework. 46% says, I don't write unit tests for C. The largest answer here is they just don't do it. This is why everyone's worried about things may break. Now, I would say, I also think that one of the things we've learned is developers at least can write unit tests. What we found in the general security community, if you go to a random company and you said, hey, we can fuzz your software, and for some reason we don't handle it out of the box, you do have to write a harness. Don't talk to the security person about it, talk to the developer. And don't call it a harness. Say, hey, do you feel like you should write a unit test? And they'll say yes. Don't worry. All you have to do is write the unit test framework, and fuzzing will just work on it, because they're basically the same thing. Security bugs are value propositions. We've gone to company after company, and we run into problems with this more often than not. And that's because the subtle thing that vulnerabilities and exploits are two different things. What fuzzing, what symbolic execution, what Mayhem does, it goes in, it finds an input that triggers a problem. We don't actually find a vulnerability right away. We have to do a triage to figure out that was a vulnerability that caused that problem. Well, static analysis goes and finds lots of problems. So what happens? You go into a sales call. The CISO has heard it all before, and he says, hey, here's some important software. If you find a new vulnerability everyone else missed, we'll buy your product. Well, what does that do? That really creates an economy where, as a product, I'm going to try to lower the bar for what I consider a vulnerability. I'm going to try to find something. Because God forbid I go into a sales call and I find nothing. I always wonder what these people would do if they went out and looked at formally verified code. They'd probably still find a problem of some sort. But what we did find is generating that test suite is a huge value proposition. I'm so surprised more security people don't do this. We recently went to a company that had to get 100% assembly coverage. It was part of one of their ISO requirements for automotive. They were factoring in 185,000 man hours just to create test cases that executed every line of code. We were able to automatically build a test suite in about 30 minutes on one of those apps that did 80% of it, just for free. Now you may say, well, fuzzing and testing are different. Testing, you assert a particular condition. These are problems that are pretty easy to handle. You run fuzzing, you see what the output is, and you just assert it at the end. Now you have a test case. Now we're not saying humans shouldn't come up with test cases as well. We're saying for things like code coverage, these are easy ways to meet that. The other thing that was interesting is we first thought, okay, well, we don't need to keep looking at open source. So we don't need to look at the OpenSSL again because people have already fuzzed those. But what we found is this is untrue. In fact, I don't know if it's mathematically true or just an informal result, that 40% of all OSS fuzz bugs are regressions. What that means is you generated a test case, the developer changed something, and now that test case is failing. Think about it, that's what test cases should do. And so one of the problems in fuzzing, and one of the things that we tried to solve is, you fuzz something, let's keep that data set. And then next time you upload a new version of the app, we can replay it. When you try to do these sort of things ad hoc, it's really easy to say, oh, I ran it, I found a bug. Oh, can you show me how to reproduce that? Well, it's on this other computer at home. Coming up with a system to store all that was super important. So those are some of the lessons we've learned. I also want to talk about how you can make a difference here, because I'm really passionate about everyone needs to be able to check the security of the software they run. So one of the things that we did is we unleashed these two products for free, Mayhem for Code and Mayhem for API. The reason that we did this, I'll share something I've never shared before. So when we got our Series A, we went and said, we're going to be an enterprise product. We're going to go sell to enterprises. Because when you want to be a company, you have to have income to pay your developers. It's a funny thing. Everyone wants, I don't understand why they want money, but they want money. And so you have to sell something. So we were going to be an enterprise. And of course, we're not cheap because developers' salaries are expensive these days. So 2 years ago, I actually got cancer. I had head and neck cancer, and I went through treatment. I had this really cool scar here where they did a neck dissection and took out parts of my tongue. And it was really painful. And I had this choice, actually, at that point. I was out for like 9 months. And I said, what do I really want out of my company? And it may be a little bit fatalistic, but I said, okay, obviously everyone wants things to succeed, but what do I want if my company fails? And I decided at that point, I really want people to have used the tools and to have an impact. And so that's why we made them free, was that it wasn't like, okay, this is, there are go-to-markets for this. It is part of our plan. I won't lie there. But it was, what if we don't succeed? And how do we change that world? The other thing that we started doing is hosting free training sessions. If you go out to universities, really smart kids don't know DevOps. Really smart kids never set up a GitHub action. They can learn in 5 hours. So we started going to universities and teaching. This is at ASU a few weeks ago. We had 450 people sign up, and we could only fit 200 in the classroom. 180 showed up. They were there for 5 hours. Now, as a little thank you, we actually paid them $100 at the end. Why did we do this? I did a little bit of math, and I figured students would rather me give them $100 in cash than spend $100 on food for them at the event. Second, so if you want to have one of these events at your university or your nonprofit, we're happy to throw one. Second thing is, when you go and you look at OSS, everyone's like, hey, developers need to get smarter, they need to write secure code. I gotta tell you, developers don't give a shit. This is from the Linux Foundation. What it says is, when you go into development, really what you're doing is you love creating and solving problems. You love writing that new functionality. And maintaining it isn't necessarily your biggest passion. This quote from it, when asked what would be the most beneficial contribution to FOSS project, survey participants pointed out bug security fixes, free security audits, and simplified ways to add security-related tools to their CI pipelines. This is why we actually go and teach students about DevSecOps, so they can do this for open source. If you think about it, actually, in this, I'll probably get shot for this. It's kind of true also with security people. Security people don't necessarily write the most reliable code. And often that malware that was installed isn't necessarily bug-free and not exploitable itself. So maybe it's just human nature, where really what we need to do is pair those people who do care about improving software quality with those who are creating the new features. It's not asking the people to do more or already working for free. It's pairing the people with the right interests. And so we started this Mayhem Heroes project, and you can find Google OSS Fuzz, great program, we're not the only ones, where we pay people to integrate these sorts of techniques in their pipeline. What we offer is $1,000 per qualified OSS project, anything that has over 100 stars that's not already integrated. We're doing this, and you can see this is very low qualification, because what we need to do to change a market is you need to get enough people doing it before it's a thing. If you go out and you say, is fuzzing a market? Fuzzing is not a market today. The only people who know this word are here in this room. What you have to do is you have to go and they have to see it in GitHub. They have to see this is a normal thing. People want to follow what others are doing so they can innovate on what they care about and just follow everything else. And so we're offering this $1,000. In fact, we have one of those kids from ASU, I think, has made like $20,000 so far over the last 2 weeks just doing this. And you can go to this website if you're interested. So I'll go back to where I started. We need to automatically find and fix exploitable bugs. Human effort just doesn't scale. People have been working on this problem for a while. A while ago, 2016 was a long time ago, 7 years. The art of the possible was set. And really those techniques, not a lot is different from what we learned then. What we really need to focus on is building that market and that awareness. Instead of looking at why you can't, start asking why you can start doing this. What can you chip away in that life cycle to make it so people are using it? And we really want to do this so that humans get out of that crappy job like I had, where you're just feeling like you're never going to win. Because we can move faster than attackers. We can make defense automatic. We can win. We just have to let the computers do what they do best so that we can do what we do best. Open to questions.
All right. If you can raise your hand, I'll come around. That mic's dead, so we'll share this mic, unless this one's still working. Not seeing any hands. There's got to be a couple of questions. All right, there we go.
Thanks. A great talk, really interesting. So you talked about testing open source software. The thing that I actually spent months struggling with was Log4j. Could you comment on if Mayhem was run against that code, what would have happened?
Yeah, well, first, hindsight bias is always awesome, and every tool will always find yesterday's vulnerability. So yes, it will. We ran it, we found it. There's fuzzing tools for Java. One of them is called Jazzer, very nice, supported by Google OSS Fuzz as well, and it will find this sort of thing automatically. Yep, so Log4j, it could have been the case. I can tell you something that's also interesting. This is just kind of fun for security people. There's a lot of vulnerabilities in parsers out there. So if you want to be kind of centric to this room, if you go look at like IDA Pro and Ghidra and all their parsers, there's probably still 0 days.
Any more questions? Let me go look online, see if any of our virtual attendees have questions. If you have a question, just post it to the everyone.
Thank you.
Don't see it.
I guess people
So
understood.
yeah, thank you for your time. It's very interesting. All right, so we've got our next speaker. It's going to be coming up talking about one codec to rule them all. If you've ever heard of Apple Lossless Audio, this is going to be an interesting talk. In fact, last night I was playing some music on the DJ equipment, and it was older DJ equipment that didn't support FLAC. So I had to convert all my audio to Apple Lossless Audio and play it on the hardware controllers. So this is out there, not just on phones, but in professional audio gear as well. We'll just take a quick second while we set up his laptop. There's still coffee outside if you want to grab coffee. I think there might be some more snacks that are still out there as well.
was.
Yeah, you're starting the battery. I just tucked it.
Let's go grab our keys are here, right on. Yeah. But they're no good.
But they might not work.
So, yeah. Crap. Okay. So I'm just gonna throw that one in the bag, like right there. And let's go take this to this. And let's cut to this. Yeah, that's the crazy. Oh, we just need a little one. There's one right here.
Yeah.
Little shorty.
Yeah, probably.
Oh, we can probably plug directly into the thing, right?
Yeah.
Only needs one. Just one, and that's all we need.
One's all we need.
That's all. We don't. Yeah. Okay. Whatever. We don't need it. Let's go.
Right now, yes, but you know, that actually was fuzzing. I will not mention it. I analyzed it a lot, but this most of interest. Yes, it's really interesting. So because we can use Apple Sour to attack Android smartphones.
All right, I think we're ready to go here. We're actually going to try to start on time. So it is 11:30. So very excited to introduce Slava, and you're going to have to help me with your last name, Slava.
Makaviv.
And yeah, so he's a researcher at Checkpoint. He's been looking at the Apple audio codec, the lossless audio codec, and he's going to show us how widespread it's become, how it's in hardware, software, and how it doesn't even matter what platform you're on because it's become so widespread. You can attack Android and Apple devices, but it's also even in hardware some places. So with that, I give you Slava.
Hey. Hello. Oh, okay. Hello everyone, thank you for today's talk. I'm Slava. I have been doing mobile security research at Checkpoint for the past six years. Reverse engineering and vulnerability research is my daily work. Today I'm going to present you with a real-life example where a vulnerability in an open source project has been integrated into unrelated proprietary project. So most specifically, I will show that an issue in Apple's audio decoder has been embedded in many platforms and has made almost all Android devices in the world vulnerable for remote code execution and privilege escalation attacks. Well, the subject of our research is Apple's lossless audio coder, aka ALAC. The ALAC is an audio coding format development for data compression of digital music. And after initially keeping it proprietary, later in 2011, Apple made the codec available open source. And since then, the ALAC decoder has been integrated into many non-Apple's audio playback devices and programs, including Android-based smartphones, Windows, Linux media players and converters, speakers, firmware, and so on. And it's more than expected because imagine yourself as a media player developer or a smartphone manufacturer. It's more than reasonable for you to add support for iPhone 5, right? But where can you get the format specification? The answer is to take it from Apple, but Apple didn't share this specification. Instead, they posted the decoder code. So you have no other choice but to add this code, and in addition, this allows you not to waste time writing your own implementation of the decoder. Great. So as a result, various software and hardware manufacturers have taken the ALAC open source and integrated it as it is. Apple keeps working on the proprietary version of ALAC, where they fix security issue, but the sharded decoder has not been patched for 11 years. So in addition, you can find several versions of the ALAC decoder on the internet. Of course, the most popular is the one provided by Apple, but there are other implementations written by enthusiasts who have independently reverse engineered Apple binaries, and some third-party vendors have been using the enthusiast provided code as not by Apple. But in both cases, the codec is not under support, and in the both cases, the shared code has critical zero-day vulnerabilities. Given the above, only one question remains open: do the third-party vendors themselves maintain code taken from the internet? It's fair to assume that many of them don't. So the ALAC vulnerabilities we found could be used for remote code execution on a PC or a mobile device through a malformed audio file. For example, an attacker can send you a song, and when you try to play it using one of the programs based on the ALAC decoder, a hidden payload will be executed. To stress, I know that Android users usually launch files directly from the file manager application, right? And this application is one of those that is based on the vulnerable code. Yes. In addition, an unprivileged Android application can use the ALAC vulnerabilities for local privilege escalation on an Android device, accessing user data and media conversations. I will show such a demo a bit later. But first, let's take a really quick look at other platforms. We started our research by taking a look at what is happening on our own workstation. So we tried just to find something, and we don't have a goal to exploit. So is alloc applicable to Ubuntu? The answer is yes, it is. We found several popular Ubuntu packages in the universe repository that are based on the vulnerable code and can be targeted by an attacker for code execution on a Ubuntu machine. We didn't have a goal to exploit. We just tried to install the packages and provided a malformed MQA file to validate that there was an issue. And I'm sure that there are other Ubuntu packages that are also based on the Apple alloc open source. What about Windows? Okay, we only tested the default Windows 10 media player. Okay, the alloc code is implemented in the MS alloc decoder relay library. This code is also based on the Apple supplied code, and but the reverse engineering showed that the most critical issue has been fixed. That's good. And we haven't even tried to check all the variety of the custom media players that exist in the Windows world. Yeah. So in our research, we focused on the smartphone devices, because if an attacker wants to steal your media data through a media decoder, he will attack your smartphone, actually, not PC. Looking ahead, I know that the alloc decoder has not been integrated by Google. Therefore, chip manufacturers themselves built it in their platforms. And so to understand what's happening on Android devices, we need to reverse engineer the decoders implemented by two largest chip manufacturers in the world. This is MediaTek and Qualcomm. And as you can see on the slide, that at the end of 2021, 2/3 of all smartphones in the world were based on Qualcomm and MediaTek chips. And both companies independently integrated their own alloc decoder into their code. Yeah. Okay. Some technical details. Okay. Open Media Acceleration, aka OpenMax or MX, is a standard for development of multimedia components. It was created by a community of various research organizations from around the world. And its purpose is to help to build cross-platform media-related applications that can be ported to different architectures and operating systems. And nowadays, OMX is widely integrated into the smartphones and TV systems. OMX provides 3 layers of interface. This is application layer, integration layer, and development layer. The application layer acts as an interface between the media applications, such as media player, and the media framework. Integration layer is an interface between the media framework, such as StageFright in Android, DirectShow in Windows, FFmpeg in Linux, and media codecs from another side, and the development layer is the connection between the physical hardware, such as digital signal processor, image signal processor, graphic processor unit, and media codecs. Okay. All 3 OMX layers are present in Android devices, and the most interesting for us is that the StageFright media playback engine integrates OMX to recognize custom hardware-based codecs provided by manufacturers. Yeah. And while Google provides built-in software codecs for common multimedia formats, a chip manufacturer can add a specific one to decode and encode a specific format, for example, ALP. So All the decoders present on the device are listed in the media codecs XML file, and according to the OMX specification for each codec, the codec name and content type must be declared there. And for example, on the slide, you can see the declaration of MP3, Opus, FLAC, and other decoders provided by Google. But this XML file does not contain information where is the business logic of the decoder is implemented. Actually, for each of the decoder is implemented in a separate dynamic library provided by Google or chip manufacturer. And we need to reverse engineer lib OMX core solve library to find the relevant library name. It hard codes which library corresponds to which codec. In case of MediaTek, things are much easier, and we don't need to waste time on the lib OMX core, since that the MTK OMX core config file contains the lookup table we're interested in the text format. And on the slide, you can see a snippet of this file. And for example, lib MTK OMX MP3 dev library is some implementation of MP3 decoder. As I mentioned, MediaTek and Qualcomm implemented their own decoders for the ALOC format, and ALOC declaration you can see on the slide, where the first line refers to the MediaTek devices and the second to the Qualcomm. And where is the business logic? The lib MTK OMX ALOC DEC software library represents ALOC decoder on the MediaTek devices and lib OMX ALOC DEC software SO on the Qualcomm. And the service Android hardware media of OMX loads a relevant library name when requested by an Android application and call it to decode supplied frames. So when a malicious Android application uses harmful frame to attack ALOC, the app actually attacking Android hardware media OMX privilege service. Let's take a practical look at how an Android application can request OMX service to decode a frame. And Android provides a framework. This is Android point media codec class to access low-level codecs from an application. And we can create ALOC decoder by using its name. For example, on this slide, we are working on the Qualcomm power device. Next, the config method of the decoder should be used to set up the decoder. Specifically, we use CSD0 array parameter. This is abbreviation of codec-specific data that allows us to set the frame length and the bit depth which we want to control in order to exploit the vulnerability. And calling the config method will cause the media OMX service to call initialization function implemented in the decoder library. I will show this function a bit later. And at this moment, the decoder implemented by manufacturer will be activated, and the media OMX service will allocate internal memory needed for decoding. Once the decoder has been set up, all we need to do is to put a frame into the decoder's queue. For us, the frame is just a binary block, and actually it may not be media data at all. And a malicious Android application can easily hide it inside the code and or download from a remote server before the attack. Another important thing to know that a malicious application does not require any Android permission to initiate decoding. Yeah. So now you know how to use the Android framework to access the ALOC decoder. But what about remote code execution attack? So for remote code execution through a file, alleged, not malware, Android application installed on the device, such as for example, file manager will call this Android API for us, and then provide a malformed frame that we have embedded inside of the alloc audio file for processing. CSD0 array which defines the decoder initialization values may be embedded in the header of the malicious M2A file. So there are no restrictions for us, even if we act remotely through the file and not through the application. Actually, we control and the frame data and initialization parameters in both cases. Now let's look at some at the vulnerability in details. I will dive into the code. So sorry for this. Yeah. And as I noted, we have two implementations, one from MediaTek and one from Qualcomm, and I will show that actually is the same. And let's begin with the MediaTek because it's more difficult. Yeah. So. As I mentioned, the CSD0 array is some metadata which contain for initialization. So when we call a config method on the media codec class, this is CSD0 buffer will be transferred to the libmtk OMX alloc decoders library into the OMX service. And in its turn, the library will pass this buffer into the init alloc decoder function. This is an initialization function. And in the snippet on the slide, the CSD buffer is called PTR. And so this function is just extract media data such as frame length or bit depth from this buffer and save it inside the alloc object in the memory. So if you will take a closer at this code, you will see that multiplying the frame length by 4 leads to integer overflow. This is a vulnerability, but we will not pay attention to this because we have another one. Yes, and okay. This function is responsible for decoding. So after initialization, we need to decode, and the first bytes of each frame are considered metadata. So this metadata or frame header contains information about the frame content actually, and such as number of samples, compressed or not, and etc. So only one flag is caught my attention, is that the flag has a size. So if we switch on this flag, we can provide the number of samples parameter again. On the previous slide, so I forgot to put attention that the buffer output samples buffer is under our control because we control its size through the frame length. But now here we see that there is another way to provide the number of samples again. In this time as part of the frame metadata. And in the code, there is no check that the buffer allocated in the initialization phase matches the size that we provided in the frame. This is a vulnerability, yeah. And if we mark the frame as uncompressed data, it leads us to this snippet of this code. Actually, you can think of this loop as a regular memcopy function with source, destination, and size. And the source in this case is our frame. We control size of this frame and content of this frame. Destination in the output samples buffer. We control its size in the initialization phase. And copy size. This is output samples that we provide in the frame metadata, so we control this size also. So we have full control of the memcopy function and we can use it also for leakage and and also for override the heap memory. So if we will will set the output buffer length and the number of samples, I mean output samples, is greater than the input buffer. This is our frame. In this case, we can leak data after the input buffer frame. But if we increase the frame, the size of our frame, and increase the number of output samples in the frame metadata, in this case, we can overwrite memory after the internal output buffer. So great. So we can leak and we can overwrite. And on the slide, you can see a crash of the Xiaomi device when we're trying to write on an allocated memory. Now I want to show that in the Qualcomm we have another code, but the same issue. I skipped the initialization function because it's the same. We have a CSV array which will be parsed to extract the number of frames, bytes per frame, internal buffer size, and so on. And all this will be saved in the internal object. And on the slide, you can see a snippet of the code, which I got from the libalex of the decoder library implemented by Qualcomm. And on the left side, you can see the part which is responsible for parsing. And again, we have the same flag with another name. This is a partial frame. It's the same to have the size implemented in the MediaTek. And again, if we switch on, we can provide in the frame metadata number of samples, number of output samples. Yeah. On the right side, you see the familiar frame. Code is slightly different, but it's the same logic. So again, we have something like mem copy, and we are going to copy num samples double words from our frame to an internal buffer. Yeah. And this is another crash on a Sony device powered by Qualcomm chip. And again, when we try to write to an allocated memory. Okay. In order to exploit, we need to bypass. We were talking about heap memory, so we need to bypass ASLR mitigation. And so far, we have had two primitives. One of the is a relative leakage from outside the input buffer, and another one is a relative write to the memory after internal output buffer. But during the code analysis, we found that we can adopt the second primitive to read data also after the internal output buffer. So all the heap memory outside the internal output buffer is over our full control. Okay. Here you can see the structure of the decoder object, and it contains many pointers, internal buffers, size of which we can control, and the internal output buffer we're talking about is also there. So if we could leak this object from memory and together with the pointers, then we could bypass ASLR. Yeah. And this in mind, we began to analyze the heap memory, and the main concern was it's possible to shape the heap in such a way that there are several decoder objects in the memory next to each other, and with internal buffers allocated between them. And so we try to make the internal buffer size the same with the size of the structure to see if it would fit in memory after the decoder. And we were lucky because the internal output buffer is located in the heap memory right after the decoder. And in fact, we were even luckier because now each pod or even decoder is next to each other with a constant distance between them. Yeah. So to exploit the vulnerability, we use 3 decoders. Okay, to leak the data, we use the middle one to leak data from the third decoder. With a small calculation, we managed to get addresses of the all decoder objects in the memory. After that, we use the second decoder to overwrite memory of the middle decoder and overwrite pointers inside of the object. And finally, we use the second decoder to decode our frame into the decoders into the pointers we fetched. So we use 3 decoders, but you might be wondering why we can't use only one to leak and write, because we have some limitation in case of the MediaTek library. And the first limitation is that we can relatively leak only 2 average bytes out of 4. Because the library does not really support 32-bit depths, only 16 and 24 with translation. And but lucky we are dealing with the service, OMX service, and one can restart it as many as we want, and so we can brute force 1 byte, and this will be enough. The second limitation here, and then for leakage of the data, we need to declare the decoder with 24-bit depth. But for writing, we want to say that we 32-bit depth. Okay. So as minimum, we need 2 decoders here. And the last one is that when we trying to write, so the number, the integer that we are going to write, it should be in the range shown on the slide. But this is not a big problem because we can write several times. And the first time we can write 3 bytes, for example, and after that shift address we are interested in for 1 byte and overwrite again with a new value at the high byte, for example, high. Okay. In case of the Qualcomm decoder, there are no restrictions. So, because it fully supports 32-bit depth, and actually we can use only 1 decoder to leak and write the data at the same time. Okay. Now I want to show you a short demo. Okay, this is. Second, I'll stop it. Okay. I will show you privilege escalation. On the left side, you can see the Xiaomi Redmi Note 9 device based on the MediaTek chip. And on the right, this is just a remote server which with some information from the malware. Yeah. So user going to install our malware application. It could be on the Google Play Store or not. So and launch it. Okay. Waiting. Oh, it's enough. So in the moment of launching, we inject our code into the OMX service. It means that from now you can remove application, close it. It doesn't matter because we already have an implant inside of the privileged OMX service, and all media data, I mean video stream, audio stream, will go through this server, the service, and we will catch it if you want. So, for example, now we close the application. It does it business, okay, and we are going to open your camera and make a video. And in moment when okay, and our code inside of the OMX service this is video stream, and for example, when we finished to make a video, the file was sent to the remote server and uploaded to my Google Cloud account. And now I see whatever you see. So, okay, this is file on my Google Cloud. It's fully the same. So this way we can see everything and hear everything you see and hear on the smartphone. So it's enough to install and launch application, or it's enough to open my alloc file. Okay. So to summarize, okay. We believe that two-thirds of all smartphones, not Android, all two-thirds of all smartphones in the world are vulnerable, and so the alloc vulnerabilities could be used for both for remote code execution and for local privilege escalation. And so, if exploited, an attacker can gain your media data. And the most important is that the both MediaTek and Qualcomm have fixed the vulnerabilities very quickly. Really thank for that. And but the alloc code, alloc shared code by Apple is still vulnerable, of course. And I'm sure that we will hear more about the alloc vulnerabilities in another products and firmwares and in future. As minimum, I know two huge projects which are also based on the alloc vulnerabilities, but on alloc code vulnerabilities, but I can't share these names for now. So thank you. If you can find many good security research on our checkpoint research tool. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any questions here in the audience? Going once. There we go. There we go.
So for the remote code execution version of it, it's not zero click, or what did you find instances where it could be zero click?
No, it's not zero click. This is one click. If you're talking about one code execution attack, it's you need to click on your file. So it's one click actually.
Okay.
It's
Thanks.
Yeah, but we can think about how to use it as far as inside of your browser to think that it's enough to you click on link and not on the file. Yeah, this is another vector of it.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. I was curious, did you investigate maybe chaining this with a sandbox escape? Because I think you're currently in a decoder process, and I was wondering if you found any other attack surfaces you could use to pivot to a more privileged process context.
So as I understand your question, so if we analyze another codex, yeah?
Well, no, because I was wondering if you found a way to chain this to a full remote code execution, like maybe getting kernel execution privileges, or maybe getting system server execution.
We can use it as a chain, of course. So for now, okay, all code is run with the media user, media Linux user. Yeah. So all that the media user can do, you can do. So of course, media. You understand that in the world of the Android, media user, this is highly privileged user, because media user, for example, you can see your media data and so on. This is from one side. From another side, media user has access to trust zone, for example. It has access to almost drivers that exist in the Windows in the Android world, and this is good. Yes, so of course you can use it as the first chain of the first step in the chain.
Do you think that Android should further harden these services? Like you mentioned, there's a lot of privilege available to them. Do you think that since stage fright, in back in the day, like they refactored the media server, do you think there's anything more they could do to make these kinds of attacks harder?
I understand, but okay. I think that media server, the purpose of media server is to be a media server. So all the to see and to work and handle the media. I don't think we need to think here about something inside of media server. Of course, we can think about to implement something like Samsung do run a trust in the inside of trust zone and check integrity of some components and so on. But I don't think that that Android that Google needs to change something inside of the services. But also maybe to think that all OMX codecs provided by manufacturers and vendors to fuzz it also. Why not? So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions here? So I have a question. I know you're pretty much focused on the exploit working on Android. Have you looked at whether or not things that use the MediaTek hardware but for different operating systems like professional audio equipment might be vulnerable? I know that there's some professional audio equipment that does use the MediaTek chipset, but then they also have a Linux running on them. But I know that like Denon CDJs have similar hardware, but they actually have a Windows operating system running on it.
Okay, so I'm sure that there are thousands of products based on this decoder. I'm sure. So yes, you're right. We focused on mobile devices because it's interesting for everyone. Yeah. But you're right. And for example, something more 6 months ago, this was found this similar vulnerability in the speakers hardware firmware, speakers firmware, and I'm sure that we will hear about more, and but we didn't check it, and yes, so in the future we will see.
Lots of ripe area for further research. Let's see if there's anyone online here. Nobody's asked anything online, so I think that takes care of questions. We can have another round of applause. So, I'm sure that you're all still digesting your second breakfast, but we need to keep those brains fed, give you lots of calories for all of this very intellectual, stimulating talk. So we're gonna break for lunch. We can have some more food, more coffee, and then we'll come back after lunch at 13:15, and we'll be talking about compromise.